Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. Welcome to Storytime with Chris James. Trying to keep my cats back. They have this overpowering urge to show themselves anytime the camera's on, or they sit behind it and wobble it back and forth. If you're wondering about the covers of my books, The Bag Company, that giant cat you see is named Rocky. We found him while staying at an RV park in Medina, Texas, and he literally followed us home. The owners didn't want him, so we took him, and, well, he was self-appointed as the cover of the bag companies. So let's begin with this exciting story, Unhappy Halloween. Chapter 1, it begins. Fall, the season of change. Trees turn spectacular color. Well, unless you live in a pine forest. Pine trees tend towards two colors, a green or dead brown. The air takes on a chill, unless you live in the South, where it can be 90 degrees in December. All the best movies are on TV, if you like horror, and the kids prepare for trick-or-treat. The parents prepare as well. Trips to the grocery store to buy piles of candy to stave off the assaults of monsters disguised as children that are dressed up like monsters. Madame Dingus enjoyed Halloween, and she decorated her entire front yard to show off her October spirit. There were 6 jack-o'-lanterns spread across her front porch, each one costing a goodly amount. All the trees had fake spiderweb, and there were ghosts hanging from the limbs. She enjoyed Halloween, but there were rules. Any kid coming to her door asking for candy not dressed appropriately would receive a lecture, followed by suggestions as to how they should dress if they wanted to participate in the festivities. Once she had properly down-dressed the offending juvenile, she would relent and drop one piece of hard candy into their outstretched bag. A stern look was also given. If the trick-or-treater was dressed in a costume, Madame Dingus felt it was her duty to point out any inconsistencies in said costume. Oh, say a witch was carrying a modern-day broom, or a zombie had neglected to put coloring on his neck. The doorbell rang. Angela Dingwhopper, a.k.a. Madame Dingus, opened the door and stared out at the little monster occupying the center of her entryway. It stood about 3 feet tall and had an inappropriate number of eyes. The body was supported by tiny little legs, only inches long. The mouth stretched halfway around its head, and teeth were sticking out in too many directions. "Well," she said. The madam was waiting for the correct utterance before any candy would be transferred from her to the extended bag. She noticed there was no extended bag. It slowly came to her that it wasn't time for trick-or-treat yet. It was only October 20th. The monster shifted from one foot to the other. He looked around as if waiting for suggestions as to his next course of action. "You're going to have to come back in a couple of weeks." She began to close the door. The monster jumped forward. As it came, the mouth opened. It opened way too much for any child in a monster costume. Madame Dingus thought this was either the best Halloween costume she'd ever seen, or she screamed and tried to slam the door shut. The monster forced the entry open, shoving its way inside. Chapter 2. School. Pam sat at her desk and tried to not elbow Sandy any more than was necessary. Sandy's desk had been slid over until the two desks looked more like one. Sandy Bellum was about to say something, but then remembered how embarrassed she'd been having to call her mother and beg for forgiveness to plead her return to the nest. While attending a party on Sunday of last month, or was it 2 months ago, see the bag back to school, Sandy had called her father, and after a brief conversation he had invited her to come live with him and his new wife. Sandy, who was sick and tired of living in the bogus house and sharing a bed with her mother, see the bag, here we go again, for answers, had snatched at the opportunity to leave the nest and seek a happy-go-lucky lifestyle she envisioned would be hers under the less than strict eye of her father. After all, he had bought her a Jaguar to show how much he loved and cared for her. And never mind all the times he had forgotten her birthday or Christmas or anything not directly involving his interests. But he was a busy man and he had to work, right? The Jaguar was a fond memory, seeing as he had neglected to make the last several payments, and the dealership had been kind enough to swing by and tow the car away. It was not drivable, seeing as Sandy didn't know you had to put gas in the tank any time the gauge on the dashboard said E, which stood for empty and not excellent. Being without a vehicle and needing to get to school, Sandy had done the unthinkable, as she had asked Pam for a ride in her tacky old pickup. Pam, being Pam, had said yes. Now the two teens sat side by side and tried to not knock things off of each other's desks. Mrs. Grampus was trying to get the class to behave and listen up to these homeroom announcements. "Sit down and shut up," she said in her most tactful manner. There were 75 students in a room designed for 30. The desks had been shoved together to make room for folding tables, and empty buckets were now being used as chairs. The back wall, as well as the side, were filled with a mixture of clothing held up by an equally mixed bunch of kids. Some of them were dressed as if starring in a stage play of Grease. Others would have looked right in place portraying characters in the play Hair. Then the vast majority of the newbies looked as if they were dressed for the 90s. If this is confusing, check out The Bag Back to School. Mrs. Grampus looked at Pam as if to say, "This is mostly your fault," which, if you check all the facts, she had had a major hand in bringing all of these new students together. Pam could only give her best "don't blame me" smile. Once all the announcements had been announced and the questions asked, the bell rang, sending the mass of young semi-intellectuals in all directions. Mr. Hammerhead had reopened the auto shop class, so all the kids from the 50s would have some place to go. The 50s girls just hung around the corner of the hallway in their poodle dresses and saddle shoes until somebody would send them to whichever class had room for them. The hippie-type students were pleasant enough, if somewhat too laid back. They mostly gravitated towards the art class or chemistry. Not that they were artistic in the least bit. It was just all of the exciting colors splashed about the walls made them think they might be tripping instead of extending class. As for chemistry class, well, they mostly wanted to create new and exciting compounds to smoke. Mr. Hammerhead was getting to know all of these students from the 60s and 90s all too well. Mr. Bonnethead, the English teacher, was trying to translate the idioms used by these kids. Pam moved as quickly as she could to get to the world history class. It was not that she was that into world history, it was that if she got there late, she'd wind up sitting on a bucket instead of a desk. Hey there, I know you. You're Paula Fack. I see you cut your hair short. How about we get together later? The guy speaking had turned and was now following Pam to her next class. No, Paula Fack is my mom's maiden name. This was an ongoing problem since about 60 of the new old students had gone to school with her folks. Pam hoped to get through the day without too many problems. As for her hair, having long hair on one side and short on the other had looked, well, off, so Pam had opted for cutting and styling so she looked less like a goth on vacation. Pam turned the corner and nearly bounced off some guy in a black leather jacket. It was old and worn, but at least the white t-shirt was once again white. Hey, you're that chick what saved our bacon last month. He had 6 similarly dressed guys stacked up behind him. I just wanted to let you know you're one Zorchin Dolly. Pam hoped this was a compliment. If'n yous ever need anything, like say some germ and it needs a knuckle sandwich, yous let me know. I'll do that. Pam was pretty sure this guy was from Texas, and he was kind of forcing all of those yous just a bit. Once that fire had been put out and the damage assessed, the home ec chemistry classroom was moved to one of the storage buildings out beyond the running track. There was a rumor going around it just might stay there until a certain student either graduated or moved to a new school. Miss Sandtiger gave Pam a look that pretty much said it all. Things like, try not to blow up my classroom again, and where did you find all these weird students, and why did you bring them all to my school? The hippies had left the room in a mess after their 10:30 chemistry class. The school had managed to salvage some of the stoves and cookware. The scorching would just have to be ignored. All the supplies had gotten wet during the firefight, which made a hammer necessary before sifting could be done. Pam wanted to plead her case and explain that Mr. Thresher had been responsible for most of the damage. She just didn't have the vocabulary or the strength to go into it right now. By 3:30 the day was done. Any mistakes would have to be seen to tomorrow. Pam walked out the door and headed to her pickup, parked across the street from the school. Jumping in, she was about to head over to the office when she remembered Sandy was going to need a ride. Sandy was actually awful nice here lately. It may have had to do with living with her dad and his trophy wife. It would appear as she had been for third place. Sandy soon discovered that life with her dad was anything as long as it was the opposite of paradise. Little things like having to put on that ridiculous maid's costume any time guests were over. Her stepmother reasoned why pay for a maid when there was a perfectly useful teen in the house. Pam put the truck in gear. You want me to drop you at the house? I need to swing by the office for a bit. Sandy was about to complain about something and then thought better of it. Would it be okay if I just kind of hung out with you? Just to see what it is that Sarah is so wild about? Sarah was always telling her sister all about how neat the Bogus Anomalous Group office was. Sure. You like coffee? We have our own barista. Pam headed for the office. The Civil War soldiers were busy harvesting the corn growing in the front yard parking lot of the old mansion. Pam wondered what they were doing with all that corn. Now, true, Sharma was always cooking dinner, and Dan was getting a bit chubby, but did ghosts really need to eat? She made a note in her book to ask about things like this. Private Bellamy was pushing a wheelbarrow filled with corn around to the back of the office. Just about every window had a jack-o'-lantern showing from it. The staff had each decided to decorate their office in light of the season. The old mansion always looked spooky, and now it looked downright macabre. Someone had set a skeleton in the porch swing. Pam wondered if it was real or plastic. Hildy was sitting behind the receptionist's desk, which was her desk since she was the receptionist. Confrontationist might have been a better title. The shelves behind her were filled with bags of candy, ready for the 31st. Here, these are for you. Hildy held out a stack of phone messages as thick as Pam's history book. Pam thumbed through the mass. Is Madame Dingus in yet? I wanted to talk to her about maybe relinquishing the dining room and moving into 3A. It was the biggest office on the 3rd floor, and Madame Dingus had... Look, just go back and read all the other books so you'll know what's going on and I don't have to keep explaining things. Nah, the old bag didn't come in today, Hildy said from behind her magazine, Machine Guns for Home Defense. Then she said, Some guy came by to see you. I told him to wait in your office. Okay, thanks. You did what? Pam turned and ran for her office. Opening the door, she looked down into the basement. 20 feet below, she could just make out the shape of a man laying on top of a pile of files. Are you okay? Do you need an ambulance or something? Pam yelled down into the hole that had been her office. I could use a ladder, came from below. Pam was trying to think. Where had she seen a ladder recently? In an effort to turn the basement into much-needed office space and storage, there had been work being done. It was on hold until her neighborhood was rebuilt, so no work was being done right now. The construction guys had left some tools behind. Wait right there. I'll get a ladder. Pam ran for the basement door. The stairs going down had been designed for servants to use in their dealings with things not wanted upstairs anymore. Since the original owners had never bothered to venture into the subterranean part of the mansion, the stairs were nasty and definitely not up to anyone's code. Pam tromped down the stairs as quickly as her high school shoes would safely carry her. At the bottom, she stuck her head in Mr. Armstrong's office just to say hello. He was examining a box that had been left on the front porch earlier today. Hey, kid. Mr. Armstrong did his best to not show any inappropriate emotions like happiness or friendliness. Pam trotted back to the edge of the cement and looked around at all the construction materials piled around the dirt floor. There it was, an old wooden ladder. It might just reach to the bottom of the hole, once called her office. A man dressed in a suit and tie walked up to her as she was trying to lift the wooden ladder. He looked at Pam. Pam looked at him and then at the ladder. I guess I won't need this after all. She stopped trying to hoist the thing onto her shoulder. What can we do for you here at the Bag Company? That young lady at the front desk said you were in charge around here. The descriptive lady could be considered the exact opposite of Hildy. Yes, as long as my uncle is away. Hi, I'm Pam Bogus. She stuck out her hand as a means of greeting. They shook hands. My name is unimportant. I represent a collective interested in hiring your company to locate a missing item. What say we adjourn to some place with chairs and coffee cups? Pam felt a need for caffeine. Mr. Unimportant followed Pam up the stairs and over to the library. The library was the biggest room in the mansion. The basement didn't qualify as a room. It was more like a lair. The back wall was somewhere over under the next couple of blocks. Pam had gotten two stools at the end of the coffee bar, well away from Wanda Murkowski. She didn't want to have to go through the whole explanation again. All eyes were on Mr. Unimportant. My patrons would like to employ you here at the Bag Company to inquire into the location of a missing book. It is of great value. They are willing to pay handsomely for your most discreet energies. The coffee cup sat unsampled in front of him. Eddie was discreetly cleaning some coffee cups while acting as if he were not listening. Sandy, not being a coffee drinker, sat next to Pam, drinking some frothy concoction Eddie had whipped up using things kept in tiny drawers behind and under the counter. This book your people are looking for, is it dangerous or unhealthy in any way? Pam had plenty of experience when it came to books doing more than just holding words together. Oh no, it's old and rare, but far from dangerous. Mr. Unimportant did his best to look friendly and truthful, as well as non-threatening. It all looked just like a politician, or a shark. As they negotiated the book search, Bag members were passing back and forth, acting as if they were not trying to listen in. Curiosity was one of the major driving forces in all of their endeavors. You could say they all had an overactive curiosity gland. When Bill Palmerhauser poked his head up over the bar top, Pam asked, "Do you have a photograph or a drawing of the book? It might speed things up if we knew exactly what we were looking for." No, unfortunately, none of my clients have ever actually seen the book. They have only heard stories and legends. He gave a disconcerting smile. You know, they only know the existence of the book called the book. Well, we'll have a look and see if we can track your book down. We'll give you a call just as soon as we find anything. Pam would have pulled a standard contract used in all bag dealings, if not for the fact that all the forms had been in her desk, which was now currently smashed to tiny pieces in a pile of files below her former office. The forms were down there somewhere. Mr. Unimportant might have been laying on top of them. So instead, Pam pulled a blank piece of paper from her book bag and wrote out a contract. There was some writing on the back, something to do with an assignment for a class. Mr. Unimportant reached into his briefcase and extracted an envelope. He handed it to Pam. "I hope this will suffice as far as the retainer goes." The envelope was filled with $100 bills, lots of them. Once Mr. Unimportant had left, Pam turned to Bill. "How would you like to handle this one?" She gave him her best smile. Sure. It's just that," he pulled at the collar of his shirt as if it were trying to strangle him. "What is this book called?" "Well, it's called The Book. That's all the information we have." The look on Bill's face made Pam hurry on. "You can ask anyone here for help and use all of our resources as well." Bill wanted desperately to become a respected psychic. He was great at finding things as long as he could actually see what he was looking for. Well, okay, I'll do my best." He felt uneasy about this. He trudged away en route to his office to try to come up with a game plan. Hilda came clomping into the library. Once she had pulled herself back onto her platform shoes, she got busy with her coffee cup. She was dressed as if heading to a costume ball for a 12-year-old, but she dressed this way all the time. Pam looked at the energy healer. If Hilda was here, was Hildy still at the front desk? All eyes turned towards the door to the reception area. Well, all eyes except Sandy's, who had no idea what was going on, and Hilda's because she was 50% of the mystery. Well, Wanda hadn't moved in so long she didn't really count. Pam ran out the door to check on the receptionist. The front desk was empty. Prince Wapo, the house cat, sat in the middle of the desk. He looked at Pam, and then he just kind of pointed his chin towards the bathroom door. He got busy licking one paw and rubbing his ear. After a few minutes, the door swung open and Hildy stepped out. "You're real!" Oops, was that out loud? Hildy looked at Pam as if she were dangerous. See, it's just that, well, I thought. Pam had no idea how to broach this subject, so she just turned and went back to her coffee cup. Once Hildy had filled her cup, she clomped out the door en route back to her office. As soon as she was out of the room, Pam let out with, "They're not the same. I just saw Hildy, and Hilda was right here the whole time." There was a collective sigh of relief. A few of the bag members clinked their coffee cups together. "Well, that's one mystery solved." Eddie pulled a paper bag from under the counter. He pulled a wad of cash out. This he carefully folded and placed in Wanda's purse, hung from the back of her chair. See, there was a bet going on as to whether Hilda and Hildy were the same person, with two distinct personalities. Wanda had cast the only vote in the negative. No one actually saw her do it, but her name was written down in the office betting notebook. Sandy began to think this place was filled with nuts. In an attempt to get on the good sides of both of their mothers, the two teens headed out the door and home. The best laid plans, as they say. Pam was driving past the grocery store when her cell phone rang. Seeing as it's against the law to drive and talk on the phone, she wheeled into the parking lot and dug her phone out of her book bag. The caller ID said, "The Madam." In other words, Madam Dingus. She clicked the answer. "Hello, Madam Dingus, are you okay?" The sound of what must have been someone's stomach grumbling about something it was trying to digest came over the tiny speakers. Pam looked at her clock. They had just under 30 minutes until one or both mothers would become unhappy about them not being home. "Madam Dingus, are you there?" The grumbling sound intensified. Then the line went dead. Sandy, I need to go check on someone." Pam turned the wheel and headed in the wrong direction for home. "Yeah, whatever. Is she a good friend of yours? Like you'll do anything for her?" Pam tried to put into words just exactly who Madam Dingus was, or is. After starting and stopping several times, Pam just went with, "She works at the office." Pam knew where Madam Dingus lived only because during one of their investigations, the bag team had used the Madam's back porch as a staging point. It was an upscale neighborhood. Big, well-groomed yards and lots of old trees. The houses were built to show off how well the residents were doing financially. Having worked as the receptionist, secretary, accountant for a few months, Pam knew how much each bag member made. "That's her home there." Pam pointed out all the jack-o'-lanterns and ghosts hanging from the house. Stopping out front, Pam walked up to the front door. Everything looked okay up to the moment she saw that the front door was open just enough to show that it was open. She knocked anyway. As the door swung open, Pam saw Madam Dingus's purple turban laying on the floor. "Hello, Madam Dingus, are you there?" Pam had no wish, need, nor desire to step through the doorway. "What's that noise?" Sandy was standing right behind her. I'm not sure. Maybe a monster waiting in the kitchen." Pam wished somebody else were around, say Mr. Armstrong, to be the first one through the door. She stepped in, trying to look in every direction at once. Something went squish under her shoe. The door led on to the living room, which held an eclectic collection of furniture. No two items matched. Several chairs were tipped over, and a couch had been pushed up against the back door. There were a few broken vases, and one or two paintings were askew. Sandy was trying to keep Pam between herself and anything dangerous, like, oh, say, that werewolf that Sarah kept talking about, or the demon her young sibling had claimed tried to eat her twice. Of course, Sandy was nearly an adult, and adults just didn't believe in things like that. Until said adult walked into what looked like a crime scene from a horror movie. Maybe we should go home and call the police, Sandy whispered in her best attempt at not shaking or squeaking. Pam was about to concede when something groaned from the kitchen. Pam would have run for the door if not for all the experience she had accumulated over the past, 5 whole months of her young life. She had learned that not all scary sounds are bad and not all pleasant sounds are good. And besides, she had spotted a leg sticking out from around the corner. Hopefully, the leg would still be attached to the rest of the body, and that body would still be alive. Pam pried Sandy's hands loose from around her arm and took a step towards the leg. More leg came into view, followed by a body, which had seen better days. The body looked dead up until it moved. Pam hurried over to what looked to be Madame Dingus. Had Madame Dingus been passed through a sewage disposal pump? Her hair looked as if she'd gone overboard with the mousse and was sticking out in every direction. There was lipstick in her ears and eyeliner on her chin. One false eyelash was stuck to the end of her nose. Her clothes looked like she'd gotten dressed in a tornado. Was that corn stuck to her blouse? The rise and fall of her chest told Pam the madam was still breathing. Oh, man, what should we do? Sandy was gaining some courage once Pam had not been devoured. Should I call an ambulance? Pam ran through her options. There were few, so she just gave a nod. Pam had considered joining the Girl Scouts at one time until she found out they didn't patrol the local mall checking on prices of sales. Now she wished she had at least an inkling of how to check someone in need of medical help. What was it Eddie had said about first aid? Pam thought back to his words of wisdom. If you don't know what you're doing, don't do it, he had said. Pam reached down, about to take Madame Dingus's hand as a way of conveying everything would be all right, even though she doubted this immensely. The hand was covered with slime. Pam opted for just sitting there and waiting for the professionals to arrive. The ambulance arrived and the medics got to work. As they worked getting the madam onto a stretcher and out to the ambulance, the police got busy asking questions. Name? The officer was young and therefore new. Pam Dingus. No, wait. Me or her? Her first, then you. The officer erased what he had written. Pam answered all the questions as they were asked. The whole time she looked around the room, trying to come up with answers to her own set of questions. How do you know the victim? Are you her daughter? The officer was staring at Pam. No, she works for me. No, she works for my uncle. Pam scratched her head. Actually, she's semi-self-employed, but she works out of my uncle's office. Have you ever heard of the Bogus Anomalous Group? Holy crap! Is this going to be one of those cases? The officer grabbed his two-way radio. I'll need a supervisor here and the CSI folks and maybe a priest or two. Once the supervisor had arrived, he asked Pam just 2 questions. Was this going to be one of those cases? And was there any way to keep the city out of it? He had allowed the 2 to leave. Pam had driven straight to the emergency department at St. Vitus to check on Madame Dingus. There were forms to fill out, lots of forms. Most of the questions Pam just took a guess at. Is patient pregnant? Is patient sane? Is patient an organ donor? It was because of Cassandra the folks working out of the office had insurance in the first place. Very good insurance. It covered everything from hair transplants to possessions. About 20 years ago, when Pam's grandfather was running things and had a tragic demon extrication catastrophe, Cassandra got busy finding an insurance company willing to work with them. In order to keep premiums down, the bag company helped the insurance company, clear up any insurance scams that came along. So far, the bag had saved the insurance company a small fortune in false insurance claims. On an ordinary day, Pam would hope and pray that the madam would go away and never come back. This was no ordinary day. After hanging around just long enough to find out there was nothing she could do other than get in the way, Pam called Cassandra. The healer had convinced Pam to go home and relax. Things would look better in the morning. The two teens got home well after dark. Pam had offered to let Sandy take her pickup and head home, but Sandy had no idea how to drive a stick shift. At least the pair had remembered to call their folks, mostly their mothers, and inform them, their mothers, of their predicament. The teens' predicament, not the mothers. Pam offered to drive Sandy to school once more, and Sandy opted to take the bus. Last night had been just way too much. She'd had nightmares about finding dead bodies and nearly strangled her mother in the middle of the night. Why is it when you have something to do after school, time slows down, making every hour last for 3? Pam checked her watch so often she was afraid she would wear the face-off. Jackie Springheel wasn't evil. She just hated most people who weren't up to her standards. There's that freak Pamela, the street urchin. The girls with Jackie all laughed, not because Jackie was funny, but so she wouldn't turn her criticism on them. They were all part of the in crowd. Their folks had money and hadn't attended the Financial Peace University classes yet, or probably ever. They all dressed in expensive school uniforms with plenty of bling and accessories to show off how much money their folks had. Pam, on the other hand, was responsible for her own clothing purchases and therefore fixed rather than replaced things. She was getting pretty good at sewing. She kept a small sewing kit in her book bag. "Where do you buy your uniforms? The Salvation Army?" Once again the crowd laughed. Last year Pam had gone to her mother, as close to tears as she ever wished to be, after one particularly bad session with Jackie. Paula's first resolution was to track down this nasty girl and give her a good pounding. Realizing this could be construed as assault on a minor, Paula opted for a less violent response. Just ignore her. She only does these things to get a response from you. If you ignore her, it won't be fun anymore. Pam did her best to tune out the insults. At noontime, Pam had found a nice tree to have her lunch under and called the office. She asked Cassandra about Madame Dingus. "I called and asked first thing this morning, but the folks at the hospital said they couldn't tell me anything unless I was a relative." The idea of pretending to be related never crossed Cassandra's mind. "So I asked Mr. Armstrong to call, and he got a copy of the patient's report. It was always amazing how Mr. Armstrong always got what he wanted. It says Miss Dingwhopper is suffering from some form of unknown trauma and has no memory of what happened." Madame Dingus is her professional name. Her real name is Angela Dingwhopper. Pam tried unscrewing the lid to her thermos with one hand. Did they say if she was going to be all right? After setting the uncooperative instrument of coffee transport between her knees, she managed to wrestle the lid off. "Yes, it says here, patient is expected to make a full recovery. It says she's getting a bunch of antibiotics to deal with unknown substances found over her entire body." Pam was glad she hadn't touched Madame Dingus last night. Mr. Armstrong also got a hold of the police report. Boy, is it long. Cassandra took a deep breath. It says the victim was found unconscious in her kitchen by her daughter. I guess that's you. The victim had been quite thoroughly trashed and looked like a used rag. Cassandra went on for some time before getting to the weird part. The substance found on her clothing was some kind of digestive fluid, and there was corn and partially digested sandwich meat with lots of onion mixed in. It also says next time call someone else. This is not our responsibility. We don't do paranormal. That last was penciled in across the bottom. Pam wanted to call the police and clear up this idea of her being related to Madame Dingus. Is Mr. Armstrong going to be able to look into this case? I'm afraid not. He'll be tied up looking into a vampire aardvark down at the zoo all week. Uh-oh, I gotta go. I'll see you after school. Pam ran for her next class. When at long last Pam was able to leave school without anything blowing up or catching fire or dissolving, she felt as if her life was at last heading in the right direction. True, the cake she had made tasted just a whole lot like plaster, but there was no smoke or flames, so that was okay. She drove over to the hospital. Even if Madame Dingus seemed to dislike Pam and went out of her way to do things Pam and most of the bag staff wished she wouldn't do, Pam still felt as if it was her duty, as her uncle's representative, to see how the madam was doing. Pam stopped at the inquiries at the front desk. I'm looking for either Angela Dingwhopper or Madame Dingus, depending on how she's listed. The woman behind the desk looked at Pam and then her computer. Angelina Dingwhisperer? No, Madame Dingwhopper. Dingwhumper? Dingwhopper. Here's a Madame Dingus. She's in room 5003. It's on the 4th floor. Pam wanted to ask why 5003 was on the 4th floor, but decided it was just one of those things. The elevator was empty as Pam got in. She pushed the button for 4 and then waited as the machine got going. It stopped on the 2nd floor. As the door opened, a man stepped in. He was obviously a patient, seeing as he was wearing a patient's gown. He had a walker held with him and an IV pole on wheels that he drug along with him. He turned to the control panel, and Pam discovered why it's called ICU. That which has been seen cannot be unseen. She tried staring at the ceiling. The elevator shook and rattled as it got going once more. On the 3rd floor, the doors opened and the man began to exit. He stepped off the elevator and was about to walk away when his IV came to the end of its tubing. Sir, you forgot this. Pam pushed the IV pole out the door behind him. Her eyes accidentally took in more of him than she wished to see. The man looked around and then said, "This isn't my floor. I need the 4th floor." He turned and began pushing his walker back into the elevator. Once he was safely inside the way too small box, Pam had to squeeze past him to rescue his medications. She quickly grabbed the IV pole and wheeled it back into the floor-to-floor conveyance. It would have been nice if the man had not been standing right in the middle of the door. The elevator bumped and rattled as it made its way to the next floor. Pam had a horrible vision of being stranded in the broken-down elevator with this partially dressed man. She felt dizzy. With her elevator adventure finally at its conclusion, Pam went looking for room 5003. After walking completely around the floor twice, Pam ended up at the nurse's desk. "Excuse me, I'm looking for room 5003. This is the 4th floor. You need the 5th floor." The nurse smiled at Pam as if she needed extra help. Back to the elevator, Pam pushed the appropriate button and waited. It took way too long, but at long last the door opened, giving her a good look at the guy with the walker and the IV pole, who was now facing the back of the elevator. "Never mind, I'll take the stairs." Pam went looking for the staircase. Room 5003 was right next to the stairs door. Pam looked at the partially open door and wondered. Should she knock first and enter, or stick her head in and say hi, or just walk in? She tried for the knock. Hospital doors are made of some pretty tough stuff. They tend to be hard and solid. Pam's knuckles hurt after hitting the hard surface just twice, and there was no sound made. But the door did swing open, giving her a good look at Madame Dingus sitting up in bed. Madame Dingus turned and smiled. Ah, my favorite young girl. Pam turned to see who must have walked up behind her. There was no one there, so Madame Dingus must have been referring to her, which made Pam really uncomfortable. The madam must be trying to be sarcastic, or was her idea of being funny? Pam had never seen Madame Dingus without makeup. She'd never seen her smile either. It must be a trap. The madam's hair was still sticking out in all directions. I was just wondering if you were doing all right and if you needed anything. Pam was halfway inside the door. Come in, dear, have a seat. It's so nice of you to come by. Madame Dingus did more of that smiling thing that was making Pam very nervous. The preferred chair looked very industrial, as if designed to hold somebody down during an interrogation. Pam sat right on the edge so she could spring to her feet and run for the door at the first indication of metal straps springing from the armrests or anesthetic gas being pumped from the headrest. Madame Dingus went on as if everything was normal. I really wanted to speak to you about the dining room. I feel like such a heel moving in there like that. As soon as I get out of here, I'm going to get all my things out of there. She took on a sudden look. I feel just horrible pretending to be a card reader for all of these years. At first I thought there was something there, but now I realize it was all just my imagination. Perhaps I should just remove myself from the office altogether. Pam was aghast. Is this the same woman who had bullied people around the bag any time she felt like it? Are you feeling all right? You didn't bump your head or something. Are you on strong medication, maybe? Madame Dingus just smiled. I've never felt better. Why do you ask? Pam looked around the room for some indication as to what was going on. She looked at her watch. She leapt to her feet. Oh, would you look at the time? I have to go. Places to go, things to do, you know. Before you go, could you do me a little favor? Madame Dingus looked her in the eye. Could you look in my purse and see if my cell is in there? I have a few phone calls I need to make. Pam began to breathe again. She hefted the shoulder bag up onto her lap and peered into the depths. There was a deck of tarot cards, lots and lots of makeup, a wallet filled with credit cards and cash. No phone. Let me try something. Pam pulled her phone out and looked for the madam's number. She hit call and listened. As the phone rang and rang, there was no sound coming from the purse. Just as she was about to give up, the phone was answered. She heard what sounded like dead air, followed by a grumbling sound. Something sloshing around on the other end of the call, and then a sharp squeal came from the speaker. That was just plain weird. Let me try it again. Maybe I got the wrong number. Pam hit the call button, then waited. We're sorry, the number you have dialed is no longer in service. Pam hit the end button. Madame Dingus just smiled. Well, in that case, would you hand me that little book, the one with the image of the crystal ball on it? That has all my contacts written down. I keep it just in case. Pam pulled the requested book from the bag and then made good her escape. And she was really pleasant? Eddie asked as he slid a cup of coffee across to Pam. Yes, it was just so weird. Cassandra was sitting at the counter. Maybe she's still suffering from whatever it is that happened to her. A peanut butter and jellyfish sandwich sat untouched in front of her. What do we do? Pam looked around the room. She's acting so strange. I'll swing by and do a healing on her. Now, maybe that'll help, Cassandra said. Are you sure that's a good idea? I mean, if she's acting nice, maybe we should just leave her like she is, Eddie put in. She's lost her card reading abilities, Pam nearly wailed. She was never all that good to begin with, Hortense said, having little time for posers or frauds. Cassandra, you should go by and see what you can do. Pam hoped she wouldn't regret this in a few days. Chapter 3 Bad Things. Artemis Gorgonzola was not an evil man. He just did lots of things others considered evil. He was the best attorney in town and was called any time some scumbag got caught doing evil things. Not only was he good at what he did, he was lucky as well, thus leading to the quite a record of successes, getting the same scumbags off with little or no time in the state hotel. He excused his actions by saying, "If I didn't represent these scumbags, nobody else would, and they'd wind up in prison." The police all wished fervently that Mr. Gorgonzola would take his business and move elsewhere, like maybe Tierra del Fuego. Artemis checked his smartphone to see if he had any urgent messages. Urgent messages usually led to huge payoffs. His offshore bank account could use a bit more plumping up. Get it comfortably into the 8-figure range. As he scrolled through the requests from inhabitants of the county lockup, the doorbell rang. He was about to yell at the maid to hurry up and answer the door when he remembered he'd fired her for drinking on the job. He didn't pay anyone to stand around drinking water when there was a mess to be cleaned. "Do I have to do everything around here?" he asked no one. The bell rang again. "Hold your horses!" He tromped across the living room and out to the vestibule. Whereas most houses had entryways, or at best a foyer, his house had a vestibule. It was that kind of fancy. He then turned the deadbolt. Next he unlatched the other lock before turning the catch on the doorknob. Pulling the door to just the end of the security chain, he looked out the gap in the door. He would have had a peephole put in, but the door cost too much money to go drilling holes into it. He looked out, and then he looked down. There was some trick-or-treater standing on his porch. This kid was dressed like a 4-foot-tall monster with too many eyes and a huge mouth. How did this street urchin get past the front gate? "Sorry, knee-biter, I don't do Halloween. Get lost." He began to shove the door shut. The door slammed open as the creature came bounding in, its too many feet all working fast to propel its round body through the opening. "That does it. I'm calling the cops. It's about time those jerks earned their keep." He hit the emergency call button he used any time one of his clients got a little too angry when they received his bill. The trick-or-treater pounced on him. 911, what's your... The scream cut the operator off. Pam was driving along en route to school when she saw flashing red and blue lights in her rearview mirror. Her first thought was, "I didn't do anything wrong," followed by, "Did I do something wrong?" which led to, "I didn't mean to run that stop sign or go over the speed limit or go the wrong way." And next, she signaled before pulling over. She stopped and set the brake, put her four-way blinkers on, panicking just a bit, thinking she'd left her pocketbook at home, found her driver's license, proof of insurance card. The little green lizard was looking at her as if she had really screwed up this time. She rolled down her window, and then she placed both hands on the steering wheel and tried to not look dangerous, which for her came naturally. "Pamela Bongus?" "Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I did whatever it was I did, but I swear I didn't see..." "Would you follow me? Your services are required at a crime scene." The officer walked back to his patrol car and got in. He drove past Pam and looked back to be sure she was following. Pam did as she was ordered. Well, he didn't really order her. He had asked in a rather nice way. Traffic was heavy, but most folks, seeing the police car, lights a flashing, did their best to get out of the way. They made pretty good time as the officer led Pam over to the hoity-toity side of town. These houses all looked like what you'd expect to see when money is just something you have too much of. After turning a dozen corners and getting completely lost, Pam saw several cars up ahead, all blinking lights and parked in a manner that suggested something very important was going on at the end of the block. One or two neighbors were standing around with a look of "what's happening" on their faces as they texted anyone they knew who might care. One woman was recording the flashing lights to submit to YouTube later today. Such action. And there were reporters. They were obvious by the microphones they were all talking into, as if reporting on a major event. Pam pulled over near the curb, a block away from all the patrol cars, trying to park the way the driving instructor had taught her. Jumping out, she grabbed her book bag, thinking she might need to take notes or photos or samples. She looked conspicuous as she walked towards all of the blue uniforms gathered around the crime scene tape. One of the officers was about to stop Pam when her escort waved him off. The lack of talking was a bit disturbing, just hand signals and facial expressions. Pam was led to the front door. As she walked, she heard the reporters begin yelling questions at her. "Are you the victim's daughter? Was your father killed by an axe murderer? Do you have any words for our listening audience?" The clicking of cameras sounded like locusts calling for their mates. The door was pushed open by one officer, and she stepped through, and the door quickly shut behind her. "You bogus?" This from a man in a tatty suit who looked to be about 50 to 100 years old. He was just over 5 foot tall, but he filled the room with his personality. He wore a fedora which looked out of place. "Lieutenant Slot, glad you could join us." He turned and walked through an archway leading to the next room. Pam followed, hoping she wouldn't see anything that would visit her in her dreams. Scary things, blood, guts, veins in your teeth. "Oh, shut up." Pam didn't need this kind of help inside her head. "What was that?" the lieutenant said. "Oh, nothing, just talking to myself." Pam tried to look professional. The lieutenant had taken one step into the living room and stopped. He waved Pam to go ahead. "We received a call at around 6:30. The caller screamed and then the line went dead. The first officer on the scene found this. We haven't touched anything. It's all yours." He stood with his hands on his hips, looking at Pam as if she knew what needed doing. Pam looked around the room. Furniture was knocked over. There were holes punched through some of the walls. The floor had a clearish liquid smeared about as if someone had drug a sack of dead fish around. There was a very unpleasant aroma lingering in the air. "This looks just like that Mrs. Dingwhopper's house, well, as far as the furniture being knocked over and all." Pam dug her notebook out and got busy taking notes. She got her cell phone out and was about to take some pictures. Is this okay?" she asked the lieutenant. "Be my guest. This is your scene, not mine." The lieutenant hadn't moved from the archway. Pam clicked some photos of the walls, the furniture, and the floor. "Is the victim okay? Has he woken up yet?" "I kind of hope not. Haven't seen him." The lieutenant looked at his fingernails. "Oh." Pam walked into what must have been the kitchen. It was immaculate and looked as if it had just been pulled from the pages of a designer magazine, except for the broken dishes and the spilled food and the slime trail which was all over the floor here, too. Thinking this might be important, Pam pulled a used bread bag from her book bag and found a slightly used napkin. She dabbed the slime with the napkin and then dropped it into the bread bag. She hoped the breadcrumbs and the peanut butter wouldn't mess up the sample. There was a knock at the door. Then a uniformed officer stuck his head in. He didn't want any more of himself inside than was necessary. This was one of those scenes that led to weird encounters and sudden career changes. They found the guy. The lieutenant turned to the officer. Is he dead? Please tell me he's dead. He looked over his shoulder at Pam as if to say, You didn't hear that, right? Pam put on her best. Hear what? Look. Paramedics are taking him to St. Vitus Hospital right now. The officer quickly pulled the door shut. Man, I was hoping he was out of our hair for good. The lieutenant looked at Pam. You need me or any of my men anymore? If not, we got normal crimes to take care of. Aren't you guys investigating this scene? Pam was hoping she was just here for advice. We don't do paranormal. It's outside our jurisdiction. We just held the place until you guys, well, you could get here. It's all yours, sister. He turned and walked out the door. He turned halfway out. Is this related to that old lady we found Monday? I think so. I was the one that found her. Oh, I hope your mom is doing okay. She looked like a mud fence in a hurricane last time I saw her. He was gone before Pam could correct him. She's not my mom. Pam looked at the door. Then she looked around the room. Now what? She felt just a tiny bit out of her comfort zone. Well, I am an investigator. Pam finally stepped out the front door, dreading all the reporters that would flock to her like wild geese to a pile of corn. The yard was empty. The street out front was empty as well. Even the crime scene tape had been torn down, rolled up, and taken away. The reporters had all left as soon as they heard the word paranormal. Great. Now I'm late for school. How to explain this one? Pam got busy driving to class. And with that, I am going to take a break here, and hopefully you all will tune in next time for the exciting next couple of chapters to The Bag Company Unhappy Halloween. Until next time, this is Chris James for Storytime.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?